chapter 17.
It's a very good question.
Oh,
we were talking about blood. Yes,
We were.
Blood again.
Whole chapter
Life is
that
in
had
the
lots
blood.
about blood. Okay, what kinds of things did it have to say about blood?
You may not eat it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. What else? I mean, there was a whole chapter.
But it was kind of a short chapter. If you kill an animal in the field, you're to treat the blood with respect by covering it and not stomping around in it, dragging it all over.
Yes. Why does all of that matter? Why are you not supposed to eat it? Why are you supposed to treat it with respect?
Life is in the blood, and
Yes.
it's pointing to God.
Right, because if life is in the blood, and then the Lord said that He has given the blood for atonement, that's why it matters, is because the life that it represents is what the Lord has given to purify people of their sin and to provide fellowship between Him and them, and of course, ultimately, all of that points ahead to Christ. All right, anything else you want to mention from the last week?
Blood is sacred.
It is very sacred. Yep.
And it applied to sojourners as well.
Yes.
They would apply this to not pollute it.
Right. You don't get to move into Israel and then just decide that you're going to live however you want because you have a different culture. Yeah. In Israel, everyone's required to follow this. They can eat unclean meat, but they can't misuse the blood.
And that the sacrifices had to be only at the sacrifices had to be in the proper place.
Yeah.
By
Right.
the priest.
Yes. Why?
Was it a pagan practice?
They were sacrificing
Yeah.
everywhere.
They were. So the Israelites were sacrificing out in the wilderness wherever they wanted. Do you remember they were sacrificing to some kind of goat spirit or a goat demon or something like that? And now when the tabernacle's been established, the Lord says that's over. So everything now has to be brought to the tabernacle, partly to protect the people from idolatry, and partly so that through the priest, the tabernacle, and the sacrifices that He's instituted, He can communicate to them the right understanding of who He is, of how they can use a relationship with Him. Because if they're just left to sacrifice however they want, well, you just make God in your own image then. You just make God how you want Him to be, and you sacrifice however you please. And so the Lord's using all this to communicate truths about who He is and how they approach Him. So from now on, they have to bring all their sacrifices to the priest in the tabernacle. Yep. And what were the penalties for not doing that or not following the commands in those chapters? It was serious, right? So this wasn't the Lord just saying, slap on the wrist if you just don't do it. It's if you know these things and you intentionally do otherwise, you're excluded from the covenant people of God. Because of how important atonement is, the sacrifice, the high priest, and the salvation that all of that's pointing to. Okay, anything else you want to mention from last week?
From last week, but not from last week. I was reading in Samuel where Saul had sacrificed and not waited like Samuel had told him to, and it brought me oh, that makes sense because of this.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That he sacrificed where he did,
Yeah.
and he wasn't following the Lord's
Yeah.
rules anyway. But
And Saul's very much just doing his own thing when it comes to the way he relates to God. Yeah.
But it made more sense in light of this
Right.
than just that he wasn't following the Lord.
Right.
There was so much more to that.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, now the next 3 chapters are going to focus on the Lord's standards of holiness for His people. Chapters 18 and 20 are going to address the sinful practices of Israel's neighbors. So chapter 18 is going to describe which practices are off limits, and chapter 20 is going to describe the penalties for engaging in those practices. So let's look at chapter 18. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You must not do as they do in Egypt, where you used to live, and you must not do as they do in the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you. Do not follow their practices. You must obey my laws and be careful to follow my decrees. I am the Lord your God. Keep my decrees and laws, for the man who obeys them will live by them. I am the Lord. No one is to approach any close relative to have sexual relations. I am the Lord. Do not dishonor your father by having sexual relations with your mother. She is your mother. Do not have relations with her. Do not have sexual relations with your father's wife. That would dishonor your father. Do not have sexual relations with your sister, either your father's daughter or your mother's daughter, whether she was born in the same home or elsewhere. Do not have sexual relations with your son's daughter or your daughter's daughter. That would dishonor you. Do not have sexual relations with the daughter of your father's wife, born to your father. She is your sister. Do not have sexual relations with your father's sister. She is your father's close relative. Do not have sexual relations with your mother's sister, because she is your mother's close relative. Do not dishonor your father's brother by approaching his wife to have sexual relations. She is your aunt. Do not have sexual relations with your daughter-in-law. She is your son's wife. Do not have relations with her. Do not have sexual relations with your brother's wife. That would dishonor your brother. Do not have sexual relations with both a woman and her daughter. Do not have sexual relations with either her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter. They are her close relatives. That is wickedness. Do not take your wife's sister as a rival wife and have sexual relations with her while your wife is living. Do not approach a woman to have sexual relations during the uncleanness of her monthly period. Do not have sexual relations with your neighbor's wife and defile yourself with her. Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech, for you must not profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Do not lie with a man as one lies with a woman. That is detestable. Do not have sexual relations with an animal and defile yourself with it. A woman must not present herself to an animal to have sexual relations with it. That is a perversion. Do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I am going to drive out before you became defiled. Even the land was defiled, so I punished it for its sin, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you must keep my decrees and my laws. The native-born and the aliens living among you must not do any of these detestable things, for all these things were done by the people who lived in the land before you, and the land became defiled. And if you defile the land, it will vomit you out as it vomited out the nations that were before you. Everyone who does any of these detestable things, such persons must be cut off from their people. Keep my requirements and do not follow any of the detestable customs that were practiced before you came, and do not defile yourselves with them. I am the Lord your God. Okay, how does the chapter open in verses 1 and 2?
Speaking to Moses.
Yes, again, over and over and over. So very important. All these instructions are not according to the people's preferences or intuitions. They're according to the commands of the Lord. So the Lord tells Moses to speak to the Israelites and give them his instructions. And what's the first thing he says to them in verse 2?
I am the Lord your God.
Now, I don't know if you noticed, but he says that 4 times in the first 6 verses. Why do you think he starts with that, and why do you think he emphasizes it?
That's the why. Answers the why.
Tell me what you mean by that.
He has the right to make the rule.
Because he's their God, right? Now, if their God were Molech, it would be different. If their God were Chemosh, it would be different. If their God was Isis or Amun-Ra or whoever, it would be different. But those gods are not their God. Yahweh, the Lord, is their God, and that makes all the difference. So it's not possible to compartmentalize worship and morality, as if you can worship one kind of God and have a morality that is totally different from who that God is. How you live reflects who or what you worship. The Lord is nothing like the gods of the nations, and his people are to reflect his character in how they live, not the character of the false gods around them. If you belong to the Lord, the whole of your life is different. So the ultimate basis of your identity is not who you are, but whose you are. And that makes a huge difference for Israel. They belong to the Lord now. They're in covenant relationship with him. And because they are his, how they live should reflect who they belong to. Okay, now, before he gets into the detailed instructions, what are the beginning instructions he gives them in 3 to 5?
You must not do what they did in Egypt and land of Canaan, not follow other people, basically.
Right. You can already see the clear emphasis, again, of who they belong to, even in these verses. So the repetition in 3 to 5 just leaves no doubt that the Lord is giving these laws so that the Israelites will not live like the Egyptians, where they came from, and they will not live like the Canaanites, where they're going. They are not to follow the practices of those nations. They're to follow the commands and the laws of the Lord. Because the gods of those nations aren't their God. The Lord is their God. So in the same way that the food laws created a kind of culinary fence around the Israelites, the moral laws of these chapters create a moral fence around them. And this is a fence that's much more serious. It marks them off as the covenant people of the Lord. And beyond that, he says, well, what does he add in verse 5?
The person who obeys the Lord's decrees will live by them.
Right,
And then he says, I am the Lord a couple times there.
yes.
Or-
Now, that doesn't mean that they're saved by keeping the law. They've already been saved. The Lord's already brought them out of bondage. He's already delivered them out of Egypt. But if the Lord's the creator and he's the source of life, then walking in line with his will leads to freedom and blessing. And walking contrary to his will leads to destruction and death. I heard a pastor on Pilgrim a few weeks ago who was talking about how he started doing some woodworking, and so he cut this big board, and it was all, he ran his hand down this cut board, down the grain of the wood, and he said, and it was so nice and smooth, it just felt so nice. And he said, and then he ran his hand back against it the other way and got splinters like all over. And he just used that as an illustration to say, when you're going with the grain, things go a certain way, things go smoothly. When you go against the grain, things go badly. And there's that kind of idea, but now in matters of life and death when it comes to the Lord. He's the one who's created us, he's the one who's designed us. If you go with the grain, if you live in line with who you are designed to be, the Lord says blessing and life come from that. But if you rebel against your Creator and you live against the design that he has made, would you not expect that you're going against all of that you end up in death and destruction? That's what will happen with the people of God if they rebel against his laws instead of taking his instructions seriously. And again, he says, I'm the Lord. His identity alone is a declaration of sovereign authority. It's like when I see this keep getting repeated through the passage, it's kind of like, I was thinking, if somebody kept saying, I am the king, I am the king, I am the king. At some point, wouldn't you get the sense that when he says that, what he says is, I'm the one who's in charge. I'm the one who has the authority to make the rules. And I get that sense with the Lord too. He is their God, but just the fact that he's the Lord means he has the sovereign authority as the creator to say this is how it should be. All right. Now, before we work through the rest of the verses, you might have noticed that this chapter is not just about sin broadly speaking. It has a very particular focus. And there's a reason for that. Chapter 18 addresses sins that throughout the Old Testament are considered the most defiling of all. Sexual immorality, murder, and idolatry. Those are the three things, and murder is not even such a big emphasis here. It gets mixed together with idolatry in the middle. But sexual sin and idolatry are the big emphasis in this chapter. And as we'll see when we get to chapter 20, the specific sins that are listed here are sins for which there is no atoning sacrifice. And you might have also noticed that there's just this overwhelming emphasis on all kinds of different sexual practices. Why would that be? Because of the overwhelming sexual immorality of the Egyptians and the Canaanites. Did you notice that he said at the end, the Canaanites are doing all of this stuff? This is what characterizes the Canaanites where the Israelites are going. Now, there's some interesting background to this whole topic, which is found in Genesis 9. So I'm just going to pause and talk about that for a minute before we get on to verse 6. Back in Genesis 9, there's this episode that's a bit sordid. It's where Noah gets drunk, and he's lying in his tent exposed, and his youngest son sees his nakedness, and instead of preserving his father's dignity, he goes out and tells his brothers, who then do the dignified thing by covering him up without looking at him. Now, why does all that matter? because the sin of Noah's youngest son, that was Ham, that sin brings a curse on Ham's youngest son, whose name was Canaan. And the curse is that Canaan will become the servant of his eldest brother, whose name is Shem. Now, what becomes clear as you read through the Old Testament is that it's not Canaan as an individual who's necessarily the object of the curse. It's his descendants, the Canaanites, who become the object of that curse. And the curse is fulfilled when the Canaanites are subdued by the descendants of Shem, who are the Israelites. Okay, now how's any of that relevant to Leviticus? It's relevant because the sin of Ham, back in Genesis 9, became characteristic of his descendants, the Canaanites. So these constant references to naked and uncovering and seeing in Leviticus 18, we're going to talk about that. Some of that might not be so obvious depending on your translation, but literally those words occur a lot in this chapter. Those things connect the story back to the story of Ham, and they also describe the Canaanites as people who are totally enslaved to sexual practices. The sexual perversion that's hinted at with the exposure of nakedness in Genesis 9 comes to characterize the Canaanites as a people in ways that are really horrific. So that by the time the judgment of God finally comes against them, like centuries later, it is well deserved. So according to their mythology, the false gods of the Canaanites, and by the way also the Egyptians, they engaged in all kinds of immorality, including rape, adultery, incest, and bestiality. Now, if your gods do that kind of stuff, it would be no surprise that the people who worship them end up doing the same stuff. And that's what happened. So the idolatry of those nations led the people themselves to engage in all kinds of the same stuff and more. So including, ritual prostitution, sexual assault, adultery, incest, bestiality, and child sacrifice. And a whole lot of that stuff was even included as part of their worship practices. It was horrible. And the Lord hates that stuff. So when the Israelites leave the land of Egypt, it's really important that they do not take Egypt's moral standards with them. And when they move into the land of Canaan, it's really important that they do not become assimilated into all of the immorality of the Canaanites. The clean laws, when we talked about, the food and touching dead bodies and all that kind of stuff, the clean laws were important, but they were ultimately superficial because they're all external. This stuff is not. The Lord he's doing more than just putting a ceremonial fence around the people. He's putting a moral fence around them to prevent them from taking part in practices that lead to bondage and destruction. Practices that will eventually bring his judgment against them, the same way it brought judgment against the Canaanites. Okay, now let's get into the detailed instructions. Well, first there's sort of a summary instruction. What does he say in verse 6?
Don't have sexual relations with close relatives.
That's right. Now, there's the summary command, and what's the reason? Because the Lord is their God, and he forbids it. Now, the obvious question is, what does he mean by a close relative? How do you define that term? Well, that's where he goes next. So 7 to 17 is going to specify all of that for us in detail. Okay, now, when we look at 7 to 17, you might have noticed that these commands are given to men. Did you notice that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not because women are exempt from them, but it's because it would typically have been the men who took the initiative. So they're the ones who are particularly on the hook for obeying these commands. Now, what's interesting in this list in 7 to 17 is that in terms of sexual relationships with close relatives, a lot of modern people tend to think primarily in terms of a biological relationship, like blood relatives. The Israelites, however, right here are told to think in terms not only of biological relatives, but also of marital relatives. So a brother and a stepsister, or a brother and a half-sister, for example. So this list of close relatives includes both biological relatives and relatives by marriage. Now, there's a phrase that's used here literally. Again, depending on your translation, it might not be obvious, but there's a phrase that's used here that literally is to uncover someone's nakedness, which is a Hebrew idiom for having sexual relations. But that phrase in particular is it always refers to illicit sexual relations. It's always in the context of something that's shameful, because it's this idea of a public, it's an exposing of nakedness that shouldn't happen. And it's always used in a way that's very strongly negative. So you could translate it to have shameful sexual relations with someone. That's what that phrase means. Okay, now there's a lot of detail in that list, but instead of just going through each verse individually, I'm just going to give you a simple summary of all the relatives a man is not allowed to sleep with. So, his mother or his stepmother, that's verses 7 and 8. His sister or his half-sister, that's verse 9. His granddaughter, verse 10. His stepsister, verse 11. His aunt, whether biological or by marriage, that's verses 12 to 14. His daughter-in-law, that's verse 15. His sister-in-law, verse 16. And his stepdaughter or step-granddaughter, that's verse 17. That's pretty thorough. Like, basically every female relative who's one step removed from him, or in the case of a granddaughter, even 2 steps removed, off limits. Now, some of the translations, mine was one of them, uses the word dishonor to describe the offense in these verses, but that actually changes the focus from what's going on. So if you look at verse 8 ends literally like this. It says, "She is your father's nakedness," which would best be translated, "She is your father's flesh and blood." Here's the idea. In talking about your father's wife, whether your mother or stepmother, she's the one to whom your father exposes his nakedness in sexual relationship, so that she has now become one flesh with him. She is now his flesh and blood, and therefore she is your flesh and blood. So the emphasis throughout these verses is not on the honor of the male relative, as much as it's on the fact that there is a oneness that results from sexual relationship that cannot be violated without completely disordering and defiling everything. Okay, now think about, remember back when we were looking at some of the ritual purity laws and how a man or woman who's ritually impure, how it affects everything and everybody in their house? That's a great metaphor for this. Because you notice we're talking about sexual sins right here, particularly within a family. How does sexual sin affect a family?
Permeates the entire family.
Everybody, right? It
Contaminates.
It does. In fact, I don't know if there's anything that tears a family apart faster than sexual sin. And think about particularly if it's sexual sin with another relative. Then things really are damaged. Like, how do you even go to a wedding after that? How do you go to a family reunion if you have sexual sin between 2 members within an extended family? It affects everybody. It affects everything. There's collateral damage there sometimes that can't be repaired. So it's a serious violation of the unity of the whole family. And even though defilement is the explicit reason that's given for these commands, it's worth noting that there are, at least 2 practical benefits that come from these commands. First of all, it helps protect the weakest members of the family, because it means that children are always off limits to the adults. There's no, sexual abuse of children, absolutely off limits here. And women are protected from their closest male relatives. All the other male relatives in their family, again, off limits. So it establishes some boundaries that protect women and children in ways that they were not protected in Canaanite culture. And the other thing, of course, is that it protects the unity of the larger family, the larger extended family, because it is intended to prevent the kind of sexual sin that would tear a family apart. Okay, now let's keep going. So verses 18 to 20. Well, what's the next command he gives in verse 18?
You shall not take a woman as a rival to her sister.
Mm-hmm.
Gee, doesn't that remind us of someone?
I was going to say, it's amazing how many of these things you have examples of in the Old Testament, isn't it? So There's no explicit command against polygamy here, but it's worth noting that polygamy is never portrayed positively in the Bible, ever. It's always portrayed negatively. And right here, the concern is not just the violation of oneness between a husband and a wife, but the fact that two sisters married to the same man will end up being rivals with each other, which destroys the natural family relationship between them. There should be a unity between two sisters, and that unity gets destroyed if they're married to the same guy. You know, and Jacob's family, Exhibit A. I heard a sermon series on Jacob not too long ago, and it is really painful to just think how these two sisters were in lifelong rivalry with each other. Just awful. God did not intend for it to be that way, for sisters like that to be in that kind of rivalry with each other. So, off limits. Verse 19, then, prohibits a man from intentionally having sexual relations with a woman during her monthly period. Why? Do you remember anything that we've talked about before that would put this off? Because of the ritual impurity, right? We know from chapter 15 that there's a ritual impurity associated with that. Now the thing is, based on chapter 15, we also know that if it's unintentional, it's a minor impurity that's easily dealt with. But if it's intentional, it's a sin of defiance, which is in a completely different category. If people willfully choose to act in complete disregard to the purity laws that the Lord has set out, then it's no longer just a matter of ritual contamination, but now it's a matter of rebellion against God. That's the issue right here, is that I think people aren't animals. They're expected to exercise self-control because sex without boundaries is idolatry. And so the Lord puts some boundaries around it and then basically says, you know, if you intentionally violate the ritual purity laws that are intended to fence this off, that's a rebellion against the Lord. It's a sin of defiance, and it's serious. And then verse 20 prohibits adultery with another man's wife. And this type of sexual relationship, it says, results in being defiled, as did all those in those preceding. But it's interesting, up to this point in Leviticus, that word referring to defiled it's referred primarily to impurity that comes from events or circumstances that are not immoral, like childbirth or having a spreading skin disease. That type of impurity is allowed, and it can be removed by ritual means like bathing or washing your clothes or sacrifice, and it doesn't lead to any further penalty. That's ritual impurity. But now in this verse, the word defiled is being used to refer to a different kind of impurity that comes from moral wrongdoing. This type of impurity is forbidden. It cannot be removed by ritual means, and it does lead to further penalty. It's a moral impurity, and actions that cause this kind of purity are there to be avoided at any cost. This is serious impurity, way beyond whatever's included in the ceremonial rituals. Okay, now in the middle of that whole long list regarding sexual sins, suddenly we get verse 21. What does the Lord command in 21?
Don't sacrifice your children to Moloch.
That's right. Did he just change the subject? Kinda. Kinda not really. Okay. How do you think these things are connected?
So children are the result of all of these.
Mm-hmm. Yep. If you're part of a nation that practices ritual prostitution, you're going to end up with a lot of children that not necessarily are wanted. So what do you do with them? And that might not be the only reason that people sacrifice their children. We know from other places in the Old Testament, sometimes kings did it. They would sacrifice their eldest son because they were trying to get their God to help them win a battle. You know, so there are other reasons why you might sacrifice children, but certainly in a nation where sexual promiscuity is just the name of the game, where that just goes on all the time, the sacrifice of children then becomes part of their religion. So they're sacrificing to Moloch, who was the god of the Ammonites, and typically the way that sacrifice worked was that the child would be burned alive. It was really horrible. Now, here's the thing. The children of the Israelites, who do they ultimately belong to?
God.
So if the Israelites start offering their children to Molech, they're offering the Lord's children to a false god. Do you get a sense of just how profound the betrayal is of the Lord to be doing that kind of thing? Not just to be sacrificing children, but to another god. No, completely off limits. God just says none of that. And I think one of the reasons this is connected is because physical adultery and spiritual adultery are very closely connected in Scripture. And that's the idea that you're getting right here, is we've been talking about sort of spiritual betrayal, physical betrayal, physical adultery, the betrayal of intimacy, and all of these sexual sins. But right here you get to the heart of it, and there's a reason why this is the center of things. Because the spiritual adultery, the spiritual infidelity against the Lord that's involved in idolatry, it's a profound betrayal of God. And God says, don't do it. It will profane his name. And then he says, I am the Lord. He's the Lord and he's their God. So don't betray him like that. Don't profane his name by offering his children to another God. And we'll talk more about this in chapter 22, but there's, in some sense, in a way that I don't fully understand, there is a very close connection between sexual sin and idolatry. They're very closely connected. And yeah, we'll talk more about that in just a minute when we get onto some of these other things. So, okay, idolatry, right there in the center, and then in 22, we're right back to sexual practices. So, according to verse 22, sexual relations are meant to occur between a man and a woman, not between two men, and by implication, not between two women either. And that was in keeping with the Lord's design that sexuality would be expressed in a marriage relationship and in a heterosexual relationship. This is a point that the New Testament, it underscores, and I would actually go further than that, and I would say the New Testament gives the rationale for this. And it's Paul in particular who does that because of the way he's reasoning through this for the Gentiles. So when Paul starts addressing the Gentiles, he's talking to people who don't have all of this theological background to inform their sexual practice. And they've come out of paganism and they sort of do whatever they want. When Paul starts to talk about these things and address it with the Gentiles, he deals with it specifically at the end of Romans 1 and in 1 Corinthians 6 and in Ephesians 5. And all through his reasoning, what he says is, a sexual relationship is designed by God to support a covenantal relationship between two people who have a biological correspondence to one another. And that's a relationship that then creates new life. That's because the institution of marriage is intended to communicate some profound theological truths about the unity between the Father and the Son, as well as the unity between God and his people. And the picture of unity in diversity is really important. And it means that marriage cannot be redefined without distorting the truths that it's intended to communicate. So, adultery distorts it, incest distorts it, polygamy distorts it, serial divorce distorts it, and homosexuality distorts it. The genders are not interchangeable, and a same-sex relationship communicates something that's a bit more like idolatry, because you're rejecting the person who's designed to correspond to you biologically in favor of someone who is biologically your mirror image. It's like being in a relationship with yourself. You're dispensing with the diversity that God designed. And that kind of unity is inherently incapable of producing new life.
Would you repeat the Romans and the Corinthians references?
Romans 1, 21 to 27, 1 Corinthians 6, 9 to 20, and Ephesians 5, 22 to 33.
Maybe again?
Yeah.
Romans 1, 21 to 27. 1 Corinthians 6, 9 to 20. And Ephesians 5, 22 to 33.
You to the what?
33.
Thank you.
Mhm. And then, verse 23 adds a further prohibition, and this time against bestiality. I mean, you might think that would go without saying, but some forms of bestiality were actually included in the fertility rituals of Canaanite religion. So Israelite law forbids all forms of that and calls it a perversion, which is a word that refers elsewhere to mixing up or confusing things. And in this context, it's a mixing up or confusing of a sexual relationship. Because the Lord has designed sexuality not just to be expressed in heterosexual relationship, but also in human relationship. And so to deny that or to mix it up is to deny the intent that the Lord has for creation and the authority he has as the creator. Okay, now, after all those commands, what does he say then in verse 24?
Do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I am going to drive out before you became defiled.
Yes. And how bad was it in 25?
What is the land?
How does it describe it right here? It's really graphic.
And
Think about that image where if you eat something that's really contaminated or just awful for you and then it, makes you sick to your stomach and at some point you just throw it up. There's that kind of picture of the land, that the land becomes so defiled. There's so much garbage going on. There's so much awful stuff happening that at some point the land just can't take it anymore. And the land just throws the people up. Now, it's not the land is a conscious being, of course it isn't, but there's this imagery that the Lord is using, that there will come a point where the people can't stay in the land anymore. The land will stop producing for them, the rain will stop coming, they'll experience drought and famine and all kinds of awful things, and then at some point, the Lord will remove them from the land. He will force them out because of how they contaminate it. And who do all of these laws apply to in 26?
The Israelites,
And
foreigners,
everybody, right?
everybody.
So again, you don't get the option of moving into Israel and then just doing as you please, because these kinds of things contaminate the land, even if these are done by people who are not native Israelites. So everybody who inhabits Israel is under the same law. And this is all the stuff that the people who lived in the land before them are doing. That's what the Canaanites are doing at this point, and the land becomes defiled. If the Israelites do the same thing the Canaanites are doing, what will happen to the Israelites?
They'll be vomited out of the land.
That's right. They shouldn't think that they can move into the land of Canaan and then live the way the Canaanites did without there being some kind of consequences. There will be. If the Lord forced the Canaanites out for their sin, he will force the Israelites out for the same kind of sin. So when he forces them out, it's not because he's racist. It's because he's sinist. It's because of sin that he forces them out, not because of their background or who they are. So they will be forced out, either by exile or by execution. But there will come a point where the Lord will not allow the people to continue defiling the land. And if the consequences of defiling the land are that severe, well, how should the people address this kind of sin in 29 and 30?
Cut the people off that do these things.
That's pretty serious, right? That anybody who refuses to obey the Lord's commands has to be cut off. But the thing is, okay, now think back on that metaphor of ritual impurity and how it spreads. If they don't remove people who are doing this kind of sin, why is that a big deal? Why does it matter if they're just like, you know what, we're just going to live and let live?
Because a little leaven leavens the whole lump.
Mm-hmm. And if the whole lump gets leavened,
It gets tossed out.
The whole nation gets-
It's of no use.
that's right, the nation will get cut off. So here's the thing, it's better to cut off the individual who refuses to obey than it is for the nation to be cut off, which is what will happen if they start to tolerate this kind of sin that just spreads and spreads and spreads until it contaminates everything. And then verse 30 repeats it, just to emphasize to underline the emphasis of the chapter. The Lord's people are not to follow the detestable customs of the Canaanites and defile themselves, because the Lord is their God. So again, the ultimate basis of their identity and their worship and their moral understanding is not who they are, but whose they are. If they belong to the Lord, this is what it looks like to belong to Him. 7 times it's repeated that the Israelites are not to behave like the nations who inhabit Canaan before them. And 6 times he says, I am the Lord, or I am the Lord your God. So Israel's sexual morality is portrayed as something that marks it off from their neighbors. It makes it clear that the people belong to the Lord. They are the Lord's possession, and they don't worship any of the other gods. So, understanding holiness from the angle of Israel's religion. Holy, in this context, means belonging to God. God is utterly holy. He's the source of holiness. And for Israel to be holy means to pursue the things that are a reflection of God's character. And He doesn't leave them in a mystery of what that looks like. He tells them exactly what that means. So in order for people to belong more deeply to God, it's not just that they have to follow His commands, it's that sex has to be kept in its proper place. Because I'm not sure there's anything that becomes an idol faster than sexual pleasure. It has to be dethroned. It has to be kept off of the throne. It cannot become their idol, and one of the ways to keep it dethroned is to establish boundaries around it, and that's what the Lord does. All right, how are these things relevant to us?
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you're reading like the New Testament or some parts of the Old Testament where the son dies and there's no heir, and then the next son takes that wife to produce the heir.
Right.
How does that work out in all this?
Well, it's a different situation because the first brother has died. So when we're looking at the instructions here, the implication is the first brother has not died. So you would assume it's subsequent to a divorce.
Okay.
So think, for example, like Herod.
Okay.
When you get to the New Testament, and Herod had a half-brother named Philip, who was married to Herodias, and Herod, I don't know how it all came about, but she divorced Philip, and then took up with Herod, and John the Baptist was not having that, right? And when John the Baptist confronts him, what he says is, it's unlawful for you to have your brother's wife. This is the law that he's talking about, John the Baptist. But that's the issue, is not that he married a woman who used to be married to his brother, but that he did it while he was still alive. So if he had died and he had married if the first brother had died and the second man had married her widow, that would be a different situation.
And the same thing with, I think her name was Tamar.
Yeah.
Tamar, because his wife was dead. He didn't know it was her anyway.
Well, in that situation, it was that he had a son that he wouldn't give to her.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
Because
and the point of that was to carry on the family name, basically. Yeah. It's just so weird.
Well, and because it's in that situation, because she was married to the firstborn son, he dies, she doesn't have a son. The secondborn son, if he marries her and then has, if she has a baby by him, the baby doesn't belong to him, the baby carries on the name of the firstborn son. But here's the thing, if there's no baby, the secondborn son gets the whole inheritance and he knows it. He doesn't want her to have a son. And so he intentionally goes about it in a way that she will not get pregnant. And so God kills him. And then the third son, his father just refuses to hand him over, hand him over. That makes it sound like she. That's maybe not the best way to put it, but.
Oh, I don't know. Sometimes
But-
it sounds kind of like that in these.
Judah had a responsibility to do that, and he wouldn't do it. Yeah.
So if an oldest son dies and he has children, then the wife is not given over to the next son. If
Right,
you have a
because,
son.
right,
It's only if they're childless.
yes, that's right. Because there's no one to carry on his name or to inherit his property.
Sonless.
Yeah, that's right.
Nobody's kind of mentioned it, but God's protecting them from birth defects, genetic abnormalities.
There is all the stuff, yeah, that
And
comes with.
STDs.
Yeah, that's right.
So, and then the other thing is, how come, was Solomon an Israelite?
Mhm.
How come he can have all those wives?
He can't. He did it against the command of the Lord.
Oh,
How did Solomon wind up?
yeah, right.
I mean, there's a
Why didn't he
command.
follow the rules if he was, like God told him he could give him whatever he wanted?
Well, that's a good question. Why didn't he follow the rules?
Well, he did give him whatever he wanted at first, right? Until he, same with Saul, he did, like, he was, until he decided to go against God.
His wealth got the best of him. He started looking at all these women. You know, a lot of those marriages were political and financial, where he's going to gain more power and more gold, basically.
And there is a specific law, I think it's in Exodus. There's a very, or maybe Deuteronomy, there's a very specific law that says when you have a king, he is not to collect wives or horses. I mean, the law said it, like, very plain. And Solomon did both. Yeah.
And you know what happens when we start getting more and more, what do I want to say? Financially successful, and we gain more and more things, and pretty soon we're taking our eyes off of Jesus and looking at.
Our righteousness is very fragile.
It is. It's extremely fragile.
Because he wrote Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Solomon. What else did he write? Did he write something? Yeah, and those are like, well, Proverbs is like wisdom, you know. But he wasn't wise.
And his sin brought consequences on the entire country. I mean, Israel paid for that sin. Not that they were innocent, because they weren't, but, you know.
They followed the leader.
But it just proves that nobody, we're all vulnerable.
Yeah.
There's only one who's sinless.
Well, I think it makes you think about the things happening in our nation now that
Yep.
go so against
They were
us.
talking.
Yeah.
And so many people that are being hurt, really.
Think about just all the damage that is done by a society that pursues sex without boundaries. So much damage. But it's just so much against what our culture says, you know. I was thinking about the child sacrifice just in relation to, you know, how we deal with unwanted babies, right? I had a Tanzanian who said to me one time, he said, about abortion, he said, how is it that a nation that calls itself civilized can defend a practice that's so barbaric? And I said, well, if you worship it, you don't have a choice. If you worship sexual freedom. I mean, if your definition of freedom is the license to sleep with whoever you want, whenever you want, you don't really have a choice. I mean, that's just, yeah. And that's so much of what is defined as freedom and equality in our culture is the license to sleep with whoever you want. And there's just so much damage from it.
And it hurts the vulnerable, like our children.
Yeah.
You know?
It does. All right, any last comments? Anything else you want to add? All right, stop there.